Welcome back, everyone. We've got some really cool research to dive into today, something you all sent in. You know, I think it's safe to say we all know what friction is like, right?
Yeah.
Pushing that heavy box across the floor. But what about when things get so small you can't even see them? What's happening at like the atomic level? It's pretty mind-blowing.
It really is. And you know what's fascinating? Even at the nanoscale, it's still all about energy. Like a tiny object moving through some material, it's going to lose energy by getting those atoms around it all excited and making them vibrate.
So it's like those atoms are getting a little jolt of energy and they start shaking it up a bit.
Exactly. And these vibrations, they're called phonons, or like these little ripples of energy, just traveling through the material.
Okay, so we're talking super tiny here, right? Particles so small that they're basically like bumping into individual atoms. And the paper you sent, it uses some pretty intense math to try and like model all this. They set up this scenario with a tiny particle, they call it the slider, and it's moving through this crystal lattice. So picture this perfectly ordered 3D grid of atoms, kind of like a giant atomic chessboard or something.
Yeah, I like that, the chessboard idea. And to simplify things a bit, the researchers are assuming that the interaction between the slider and the crystal is pretty weak, and that lets them use this really cool tool, it's called linear response theory, to analyze the slider's motion, so they can treat it as basically moving at like a constant speed.
Okay, so we've got this slider, this super tiny particle just cruising through this crystal lattice, but to actually figure out like how much friction the slider is experiencing, they need to like describe the forces between the slider and the atoms, right?
Right. And that's where things get a bit tricky. Because, in the quantum world, things get really strange. Like, the slider could theoretically get so close to an atom that the energy between them would, well, it would just become enormous. Kind of like, two magnets repelling each other with just insane force, but at, like, super close range.
So they needed a model that wouldn't just like explode at those close distances.
Exactly.
The paper mentioned something called a modified Leonard-Jones potential. Can you break that down for me a bit?
Sure. So a regular Leonard-Jones potential, think of it like two magnets again. At, a moderate distance, they kind of attract each other gently, but get them too close and boom, they repel really strongly. The problem is with this slider, it could get so close to an atom that the repulsion would become so strong it just wouldn't make sense. It would just break the whole, the weak interaction assumption that we started with.
So they had to like tweak things a little bit to make it work.
Exactly. They had to modify the potential to keep the interaction, kind of well-behaved, even when the slider gets super, super close to an atom.
Okay. So it sounds complicated. But they don't just stop at describing the setup, right?
Right.
They actually come up with a way to calculate the actual friction force that's acting on the slider, don't they?
They do. They actually derived this formula, which is equation 1 in the paper. And you're right. It might look kind of intimidating at first, but it tells us some really cool stuff about how friction works at this, super tiny scale.
All right, so break it down for me. What kind of factors are influencing the friction, according to this formula?
Okay, so one of the key things is this thing called the Fourier transform of the interaction potential. I know it sounds complicated, but imagine you drop a pebble in a pond. You see the ripples spreading outward, right?
Yeah.
Well, that shows you how the pebble's influence is kind of traveling through the water. So similarly, the Fourier transform describes how the slider's influence, its forces, are spreading through the crystal lattice.
Okay, I think I'm starting to see the picture here. So like the shape of that interaction potential, the way the forces are changing with the distance, that's actually affecting how those forces are like traveling through the crystal.
Exactly. But there's more. We also have the Debye-Waller factor, which is this really cool thing. It basically accounts for the fact that even at absolute zero, the coldest possible temperature, the atoms in a crystal are always jiggling around a little bit.
Wait, so you're telling me that even in a perfectly still, like frozen crystal, the atoms are still moving?
Yep. It's because of quantum effects. They never completely stop moving.
Wow. And why does that matter for all this? Like, why should I care that these atoms are doing a little dance?
Well, because that jiggling affects how the slider interacts with the crystal. Imagine you're trying to like walk through a crowd of people, but they're all constantly shifting and moving around. It's going to be trickier, right? Well, the Debye-Waller factor helps capture that kind of dynamic environment within the crystal.
Okay, so it's like the crystal's alive, even at its coldest state.
Yeah.
But there's one more piece to this formula, right? Something about the crystal itself.
You got it. It's a term for the crystal's internal damping. because no crystal is, perfectly rigid. Vibrations are going to die out eventually. So this term represents how efficiently the crystal can dissipate the energy from those vibrations, kind of like the sound of a bell fading away over time.
Okay, so we've got this formula. It's taking into account how the forces spread, how the atoms are jiggling, and how the crystal itself is dampening those vibrations. But there's more to it than just like adding these things together, right? The paper talks about a resonance condition. What's that all about?
Yeah, this is where it gets really cool. Think about pushing someone on a swing. You get the most effect if you push at just the right time, in sync with the swing's natural rhythm. Well, friction peaks when the slider's speed matches the speed of certain vibrations in the crystal. It's like hitting a sweet spot for transferring energy.
So it's like the slider is like hitting the crystal at just the right speed to really get those atoms vibrating.
Yeah, exactly.
Awesome. So it's not just the speed of the slider, but it's also how that speed matches up with the crystal's, with its own vibrations. It's like this like delicate dance between the two. But okay, hold on. How do we actually know that this formula works?
Yeah.
It's all based on this like theoretical model.
Right, but that's the beauty of this. The researchers, they actually tested it out. They ran computer simulations of the slider moving through the crystal.
So they took this model and they like built a little virtual world to see if it held up.
Exactly. And get this, the results were incredibly close. Like the formula's predictions matched the simulations really, really well. It was awesome. It just shows how powerful this tool is for capturing this, this complex dance of forces and vibrations that's happening at the atomic scale.
Wow. So it actually works. It's like they cracked the code of friction at the nanoscale. But wait, there's a twist, right? There's always a twist. Something about where the slider is inside the crystal lattice. That matters too, doesn't it?
Oh, you're good. You pick up on everything.
Yeah.
Yeah, it turns out that the formula actually works differently depending on where the slider is located within that crystal lattice.
Really? So like the slider's exact path through this atomic maze actually makes a difference. That's wild. Tell me more.
Yeah. So it turns out that if the slider goes through the center of the cubes that the atoms make, friction peaks at a different speed than if it travels like between rows of atoms.
So the slider's exact route through all those atoms really matters. Why is that?
It all goes back to that interaction potential we talked about. You know, how the force between the slider and the atoms changes with the distance between them. Well, where the slider is affects how it like feels those forces as it moves along. Sure, imagine you're driving through a city. Like if you're cruising down a wide avenue, it's going to feel different than, weaving through those narrow, crowded streets.
Yeah, totally. Like on the avenue, you've got all that space, but in the narrow streets, you're like constantly feeling the walls closing in.
It's kind of the same idea, but at the atomic level. So when the slider's traveling through the center of those atomic cubes, it's in a pretty symmetrical environment, right? All the forces from the atoms around it are kind of balanced.
So it's like in the middle of an open space.
Yeah.
Just cruising along.
Exactly. But when it travels between those rows of atoms, it gets much closer to individual atoms, so it's going to feel a much stronger repulsive force.
It's like squeezing through a tight spot, right?
Exactly. And that difference in how the slider feels the interaction potential, it leads to those different friction behaviors that they saw in those simulations.
Wow, that's so cool. Who knew that, like, the slider's exact path would be so important? This research is honestly amazing. Right. But it's all based on, like, a really perfect situation, right? Yeah. A perfect crystal, a single slider, and all that. How does any of this actually apply to the real world where, things are messy, materials aren't perfect, and there are just, like, tons of atoms interacting?
That's the million-dollar question. And it's something that researchers are still working on. But the thing is, real materials, they aren't these like perfectly ordered crystals. They have edges, they have imperfections, all kinds of things that can mess with friction.
So it's like the difference between like a pristine, perfectly polished diamond and like a rock you find on a hike, right? They're both made of crystals, but the rock's got all those, bumps and cracks.
Exactly. And those imperfections, they're called defects, and they can act like pinning points for the slider. So it's much harder for it to move smoothly. Imagine trying to drag a sled across a field full of hidden rocks and tree roots. Not exactly a smooth ride, right?
Right. Okay, so defects make things a lot more complicated. But what about the surface of the material? Don't, like, the atoms at the surface act differently than the ones that are, deep inside?
Yeah, definitely. At the surface, those atoms have fewer neighbors, right? So that can actually change how they vibrate and how they interact with the slider. Think about those edge pieces on a jigsaw puzzle. They have a different shape because, well, they're not surrounded by other pieces on all sides.
So the surface atoms are like those edge pieces, kind of playing by their own rules.
Exactly. And that can lead to, friction that's different from what you'd expect just from the material itself.
So we've got defects, we've got surface effects. It's getting pretty complicated. But what about the forces themselves? The paper focuses on one specific type of interaction, but what if the interactions between the slider and the atoms are way more complex in real materials?
Yeah, that's a really good point. The Lennard-Jones potential, even the modified version, it's still a simplified model, right? In real systems, the interactions can depend on all kinds of things, like electronic structure, the types of chemical bonds, and even if there are any lubricants around.
So it's like comparing a simple toy car rolling down a ramp with a Formula One race car,
Yeah.
with all its fancy aerodynamics and tires.
Totally. Accounting for all those things would mean, going way beyond our assumptions and using even more complex models.
So this research is an amazing start, but there's still a lot to figure out about friction in the real world.
Absolutely. And that's what makes this field so exciting. There are still so many questions to answer.
For sure. I mean, imagine having a tool that could, predict friction at the atomic level. We could design materials with, crazy precision.
Oh, yeah. Think about, coatings that could drastically reduce friction in engines. That would be huge for efficiency and, cutting down on emissions.
Or even, tiny robots that move with incredible smoothness,
Yeah.
that could revolutionize, medicine and manufacturing.
There's so much potential.
It's like this research is giving us a sneak peek into a future where friction isn't this thing we're always fighting against. It's something we can control and use to our advantage. Before we get too carried away, I want to go back to something that's been kind of bugging me. The paper mentions that the friction formula works differently depending on where the slider is in the crystal lattice, right? What's going on at the atomic level that makes that little difference in position so important?
That's a great question. And to understand that, we got to, zoom in even closer and look at how the forces and the vibrations are interacting at that nanoscale level. We need to revisit the interaction potential.
Okay, so we're going from the big picture to, a close-up of the atoms and the forces between them.
Think of the slider like a tiny probe,
Yeah.
It's carefully moving through the crystal lattice, kind of like an explorer mapping out new territory.
And the interaction potential, that curve we were talking about earlier, that's like the explorer's map, right? It tells the slider what kind of forces it's going to run into.
Exactly. It's like a topographical map, but instead of showing mountains and valleys, it's showing the peaks and valleys of the energy landscape that the slider has to, travel through.
So those peaks are like places where the slider's trying to squeeze into a tight space between atoms.
Right. And the valleys are like places where the slider's being pulled in towards the atoms, kind of like rolling down a hill.
Got it. So remember how the researchers tested out two different paths for the slider? One through the center of those cubes that the atoms make, and the other between rows of atoms?
Yeah.
Well, they found that friction peaks at different speeds depending on which path the slider takes. Why is that?
Because the slider experiences that interaction potential differently on each path. So when it's going through the cube centers, everything's pretty symmetrical. The repulsive forces from all the atoms around it are kind of balanced out.
It's like being in a crowded room, but everyone's pushing on you evenly from all sides, so you're not really moving anywhere.
Exactly. But when the slider's going between rows of atoms, it gets way closer to individual atoms, so it's going to feel a much stronger repulsive force from those close neighbors.
It's like squeezing through a narrow hallway. You really feel those walls.
And that difference in how the slider experiences the interaction potential, that's what leads to those different friction behaviors that we see.
So it's not just how fast the slider is going, but also its exact position relative to those atoms. It's like navigating a city. Driving down a wide avenue is way different from weaving through those tiny side streets, right?
Yeah, that's a great analogy. And at the atomic level, that subtle difference in position can have a big impact on how much friction the slider's experiencing.
This is seriously mind-blowing. I can't believe that something so small, like where the slider is in that atomic maze, can make such a big difference.
It just goes to show how sensitive friction is to the details of the nanoscale world.
Totally. And that complexity is what makes nanofriction so interesting and challenging to study. We've gone from this perfect world of crystals to the real world of defects and surface effects. And we even zoomed in to see how the slider's position can affect friction. But I have one last question. We've been talking about this tiny particle, a single slider, moving through a material. But in the real world, it's like surfaces rubbing against each other with zillions of atoms all interacting at once. So, like, how does any of this research apply to that, to that big scale stuff?
That's the bridge we need to build, right? How do we go from the microscopic to the macroscopic?
It's like trying to figure out how, like, the behavior of one ant in a colony affects the whole colony.
Right, and it's a big challenge. What we learn from single particle friction can definitely help us understand big scale friction, but there are a lot of other things that come into play when you've got, huge surfaces in contact.
Okay, so what are some of those extra things we need to think about when we're talking about, like, the real world?
Well, real surfaces, they're not perfectly smooth, right? They've got all these little bumps and valleys, even like bigger dips and ridges, and that can really change how they rub against each other.
So it's like sandpaper versus a smooth countertop. They're both surfaces, but they feel totally different, and things slide across them differently.
Exactly, and all that roughness, it creates all these contact points where atoms from the two surfaces are close enough to, feel those forces we've been talking about.
So instead of one slider, we've got like a zillion tiny sliders, all interacting with the other surface.
Yeah, kind of. And the thing is, those forces can be really different depending on, like, the exact shape of the surfaces at each point.
Like a million tiny fingers all pushing and pulling on each other.
And all those interactions together, that's basically what gives us the friction that we feel, in the real world.
Okay, so roughness means lots of contact points, and each one's got its own little force party going on. But wait, there's more, right? What else is different when we scale things up?
Oh, yeah. We can't forget about the environment. Like, is there air? Is it humid? Are there any lubricants around? All that can have a huge effect on friction, too.
Yeah, it's way easier to push a box across a wet floor than a dry one, right?
Right, exactly. Lubricants, for example, they can create a thin film between the surfaces, so the atoms aren't in direct contact. That means less friction.
So it's like putting tiny ball bearings between the surfaces so they can glide past each other more easily.
Yep. And things like air and humidity can actually make these thin layers of molecules form on the surfaces, and those can affect friction too.
Wow, so even things you can't see, like air, can have a big effect on how surfaces rub together.
It's all connected.
Okay, so we've got roughness, we've got all these contact points, we've got the environment to think about. It's starting to sound like real-world friction is way more complicated than what we've been talking about with that single slider.
It is. Studying that single particle friction is a great start, but we need more complex models and more experiments to really understand all the details of how macroscopic friction works.
It's like trying to predict the weather. Like, you can know the basic science behind it, but to actually predict what the weather's going to be like tomorrow, you need really complex computer models and tons of data.
Exactly. And that's where things are headed in tribology, the science of friction and wear. Scientists are always trying to figure out new ways to understand, control, and use friction for all kinds of applications.
It's like where the tiny world of atoms meets the big world that we live in. Those tiny atoms, they can actually affect how machines work, how much gas our cars use, even how we walk.
It's pretty amazing when you think about it.
Absolutely. And as we learn more about friction, who knows what kind of crazy new stuff we'll be able to do. But before we wrap up, I want to leave everyone with one last thought. We usually think of friction as this bad thing, something we're trying to get rid of. But what if we could use it to our advantage? Like, what if we could control friction and make it work for us?
Ooh, I like that. What if friction wasn't the enemy?
Right. Because it's not always bad. Friction is what lets us walk without slipping. It lets us hold things, even start fires. It shapes our world in so many ways.
And as we learn more about how friction works at that super tiny scale, we might be able to design it, control it in ways we never could before.
Imagine surfaces that could, like, switch between high and low friction whenever you want, or materials that could change how much friction they have depending on, like, the temperature or the weather.
That would be amazing. Think about, like, tires that could automatically adjust their grip to the road, no matter if it's raining, snowing, or dry.
Whoa. The possibilities are endless.
And all thanks to friction.
Well, everyone, that's about all the time we have for today's deep dive. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.